Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Tried by the Fire with Yoshi. This is part 4 of discovering the originality of the New Testament. If you haven't seen parts 1 through 3, please go back and watch those, and let's get into it. This brings us to a category of evidence that we cannot ignore. Structural translation errors where the Greek text breaks both the narrative and the math, resulting in a contradiction that you get in the Greek and English. In Matthew chapter 1, the text introduces a massive contradiction by using a single famous phrase, Joseph, the husband of Mary. By identifying Joseph this way, the Greek text immediately causes two massive problems. First, it completely breaks the math of the text. Verse 17 explicitly states that there are exactly 14 generations from the Babylonian exile to the Mashiach. But if you actually count the names listed on the page, you only find 13. An entire generation is missing. Second, it creates a historical contradiction with Luke chapter 3, which states that Joseph's father was a man named Heli, while Matthew claims his father was Yaakov. Both the missing generations and the broken lineage disappear the moment you look at the original Aramaic text. In Aramaic, verse 16 does not use a specific word for husband. It uses the title Gavra. In Semitic tradition, Gavra literally means guardian. Under Jewish law, a woman's legal guardian is always her father until the day she is married, at which point her legal guardianship transfers to her husband. When a Greek translator looked at the text, he saw the name Joseph paired with the word Gavra, and he blindly assumed it was talking about Joseph, the husband of Mary. But it wasn't. There were two different men named Joseph in this narrative. This shouldn't surprise us. Joseph was one of the top 16 most common names in Judea at the time, making it incredibly frequent for families to share the name. The original Aramaic text actually reads, Yaakov begat Yosef, the Gavra, the father and guardian of Mary, of whom was born Yeshua. Matthew was tracking Mary's lineage through her father, Joseph. By mistakenly translating Gavra as husband, the Greek text accidentally deleted an entire generation, collapsing Mary's father and her husband into the exact same person. The moment you restore Matthew's father Joseph to the line, you find the exact 14 generations Matthew promised, and the contradiction with Luke vanishes. Next is a category of evidence that directly exposes the translation layer of the Greek text, the presence of direct Aramaic quotes. Throughout the Greek Gospels, the authors frequently stop their narrative to write out the raw phonetic sounds of Aramaic words spoken by Yeshua, such as Talitha Kumi when he heals a little girl. In the Greek text, these words are immediately followed by an explanatory side note, which means, being interpreted, little girl, arise. But when you open an Aramaic text, these awkward translation notes do not even exist. The narrative simply moves forward in its native tongue. This detail completely reverses the mainstream narrative. If the Aramaic text were merely a late translation copied blindly from the Greek, the translator would have been trapped by a Greek layout, resulting in a ridiculous sentence that reads, he said Talitha Cumi, which means Talitha Kumi. The fact that these explanatory notes are entirely missing in the Aramaic proves it is the unbroken native source. Furthermore, the presence of these raw Aramaic phrases inside the Greek text tells us exactly how the Greek New Testament was constructed. The Greek translators chose to leave these specific phrases untranslated out of extreme religious reverence, desperate to preserve the exact sacred vocal sounds Yeshua used when performing a miracle. But to keep those exact words, they had to copy them letter for letter directly from an underlying Aramaic script. The Greek text did not invent these phrases out of thin air. It left behind an undeniable paper trail showing that it was physically dependent on an original Aramaic foundation. This brings us to another powerful category of evidence for Aramaic primacy: translation scars left behind by foreign phrasing. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 22, Yeshua states that if your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. Because there is no immediate explanation here, readers are left trying to figure out what a single eye actually means. It sounds like maybe a figure of speech concerning focus, but it's a guessing game. The text becomes clear the moment you look at the underlying Aramaic text. In Aramaic, having a single eye or a good eye is a fixed, everyday idiom that it specifically means to be generous, charitable, and open-handed. Yeshua was not giving a lecture on focus. He was simply saying that if you are generous, your whole life will be full of light. But because the Greek translator blindly forced a rigid, word-for-word translation of the Semitic idiom into a language where the phrase did not exist, the natural meaning was completely masked. We see the exact same translation scar create a different problem when you look at the parable of the laborers in the vineyard in Matthew chapter 20, verse 15. The landowner confronts a worker over a wage dispute by asking if his eye is evil because the landowner is good. Now, based on the context of a financial dispute, most readers naturally understand that this means to be envious or jealous. The narrative situation makes the meaning clear to us, even though a physical evil eye is still not the natural reading of the literal words in English or Greek. In the native Aramaic language, having an evil eye is the direct opposite idiom to the single eye. It's the standard cultural expression for being stingy, greedy, or envious, which is why it fits the vineyard contract dispute perfectly. The context makes sense to us because the underlying Aramaic thought pattern fits the situation perfectly, even while the literal Greek and English translations fail to express it naturally. Let's look at another powerful, undeniable Semitic idiom in Paul's letters. This one is found in Romans chapter 11, verse 8. In the standard Greek and English text, Paul describes the spiritual state of rebellious Israel by writing that God gave them a spirit of slumber. The literal Greek word used here is katanixis, which means a deep sleep, stupor, or numbness. If you read this through a Western lens, because we don't speak this way normally, you may try to understand that it means they are unaware or unable to hear God's word. It's a guessing game to understand the meaning. The confusion clears up when you read it through the native Semitic idiom preserved in the Aramaic Peshitta. The Aramaic text uses the root damacha, which literally means to sleep, but functions as a common everyday idiom for stubbornness, hard-heartedness, and willful blindness. When an Aramaic speaker from Judea said someone was sleeping, they meant the person was rigidly closing their eyes to facts standing right in front of them, acting completely unmovable and stubborn. Paul was using a standard cultural idiom to explain that the people were stubbornly locking their minds against the truth. The Greek translator saw the Semitic idiom for stubbornness and awkwardly translated it into a literal description of sleep, forcing a physical metaphor into a basic cultural expression. We see this exact same translation scar create unnatural phrasing when you move over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 5 and Colossians chapter 1 verse 13. In these letters, Paul uses highly unusual expressions, calling believers son of light and calling Mashiach the son of his love. To anyone reading natively in the Greek or Western world, stacking the word son right next to an abstract concept like light or love sounds incredibly forced. It leaves behind an awkward grammatical structure that native Greek writers simply did not use. The bumpy phrasing vanishes the moment you look at the underlying Aramaic text. In Aramaic, this is a universal grammatical idiom known as bar, meaning son of. Whenever a Semitic speaker wanted to say that someone possessed a specific character trait or belonged to a certain category, they rarely used standard adjectives. Instead, they literally called them the son of that trait. To say someone is peaceful, you call them a son of peace. To say someone belongs to the truth, you call them a son of light. Paul was not trying to invent a strange poetic metaphor in Greek. He was communicating through a standard Semitic idiom that simply meant people of the light. The only reason the Greek text reads so awkwardly is because the translator mechanically carried over the phrase word for word, creating a stiff translation scar rather than translating the actual cultural meaning behind the original Aramaic thought. Next, we have a category of evidence that provides objective, mechanical proof of a translation layer: polysemic translation errors. This happens when a single Aramaic word carries two completely different meanings, or when two Aramaic letters look nearly identical on the page. When the original text was forced into Greek, the translators occasionally chose the wrong meaning for the context, leaving behind clear linguistic fingerprints on the Greek page. We see a striking example of this by comparing the parallel passages of Matthew chapter 23 verse 26 and Luke chapter 11 verse 41. In this speech, Yeshua confronts the Pharisees about hypocritical cleanliness. In the Greek text of Matthew, the verse reads, "Cleanse first the inside of the cup and the platter." But in the Greek text of Luke, the exact same sentence is translated as, "But rather give alms of such things as you have, and behold, all things are clean unto you." Text critics are left asking why one gospel says to clean the cup, while the other says to give charity. The contradiction vanishes the moment you look at the physical letters of an ancient Aramaic script. The Aramaic word for cleanse is dahu, while the Aramaic word for give alms is zahu. In the ancient alphabet, the letter Daleth and the letter Zayin are virtually identical, distinguished only by a microscopic bend. The original Aramaic text used the word for cleanse, but the translator for the book of Luke misread the physical letter on the page, mistook it for a zayin, and incorrectly translated it into Greek as giving alms. We see another undeniable translation scar in the Lord's Prayer itself, comparing Matthew chapter 6 verse 12 with Luke chapter 11 verse 4. In the Greek text of Matthew, the prayer reads, "And forgive us our debts." But in the Greek text of Luke, it says, "And forgive us our sins." Why does one text use economic legal terms while the other uses religious terms? It's because they were both translating from a single Aramaic word, chovah. In the Aramaic language, chovah natively carries a dual meaning. It is simultaneously the literal word for a financial debt and the theological word for a sin. There was no contradiction in the original speech. The word chovah was used, and when it was translated into Greek, one translator chose the literal financial definition while the other translator chose the religious definition. The split on the Greek page is a permanent fingerprint showing that both texts were drawing from a uniform Aramaic source. Finally, we see this translation freeze in the list of the 12 disciples in Matthew chapter 10 verse 4 and Mark chapter 3 verse 18. Many older translations call Simon Simon the Canaanite, translating the Greek word Kananaios. To a historian, calling a first-century Jew a Canaanite makes absolutely no sense because the Canaanites were the ancient pagan enemies of Israel who had been completely conquered, displaced, or absorbed centuries before the New Testament era. There was no functioning nation or distinct ethnic identity of Canaanites left in the first century Judea for Simon to belong to. The book of Luke corrects this historical absurdity by calling him Simon the Zealot, using the Greek word zelotes. The confusion untangles when you look at the native language. The Aramaic word for a political zealot is kanana. When the text for Matthew and Mark were translated into Greek, the translator did not know how to handle the political term, so they clumsily copied the raw Aramaic sounds letter for letter into Greek, producing Kananaios. The translator for Luke actually understood the word and properly translated its meaning into the native Greek word for a political revolutionary. The raw Aramaic linguistic scar was left behind on the page, proving that the Greek text was physically dependent on an underlying Semitic document. That's it for part 4. The next video will be the last of the series. I'm going to have a harsh word for the mainstream scholars and then go into just how extensive, immaculate, and solid the manuscript evidence for the Aramaic Peshitta actually is. Shalom.